Good evening, everybody, and I'd like to add my welcome. Tonight's event is a first for our two societies. It was suggested by Richard Keeble, who was my predecessor of chair of the Orwell Society. My connections with Orwell go back to my father, who was, for those who've read Homage to Catalonia, you will have met him as George Copp in Homage to Catalonia, and he remained a lifelong friend of Orwell. And through my mother's side, Orwell's son and I are cousins. So I'd like to hand over now to Alan, who will introduce himself to the Orwell Society members.
Hello, everyone. On behalf of the D.H. Lawrence Society, I give you a very warm welcome. I've been chair of the DHLS since early 2020, and I felt so privileged to be surrounded by such wonderful people from all walks of life, all corners of the globe, as well as, of course, the loyal Eastwood Nottingham community. I'm a retired musician, both academic and performer, though I'm still very active in my new life. But moreover, I'm a child of Eastwood, Lawrence's birthplace, of course, and that has a great sort of connection for me. My love for Lawrence has just simply grown over the years, and along with all my friends and colleagues from the Society, we just feel he's one of the finest of English literature people. However, there are other great writers too, and it's such a joy tonight to join with the Orwell Society and share and discover the pen of another great writer. So a big thank you to Neil, Quentin and Richard for inviting us to this celebration, and we all greatly look forward to the evening's show.
Thank you. The order of play is that Brenda will speak first on Lawrence, and then Richard will follow on. If I could just introduce you to Brenda. Brenda's been a member of the D.H. Lawrence Society since 2004 and progressed through being a council member to becoming their secretary, and she's been secretary for now 11 years or so. Brenda completed her initial degree in English and History at the University of Wales and then converted to law. She worked as a solicitor in private practice and then for Leicester City Council, and has since brought up her family. She also worked, she says, behind the scenes, but I'm sure it was very much appreciated, the help she gave to her husband's law commercial practice. She went back to studying again in '97, did a master's on D.H. Lawrence and the Modern Age, and subsequent in 2008, did a second master's on the history of art at Leicester. She's widely travelled, lived for 2 years in the Solomon Islands in the 1980s, and currently has 2 of her 4 sons living in the Far East. And she is hoping to get to see them as soon as travel restrictions allow. Apart from travel, she's a keen gardener and loves opera and ballet. Over to you, Brenda.
Good evening. Thank you, Quentin, for your introduction. My talk this evening is on D.H. Lawrence and censorship, focusing on the legal censorship of his work in England. On the 4th of March 1930, 2 days after Lawrence died, the Daily Mail, in its obituary column, noted that Lawrence found himself repeatedly in conflict with the censorship in England and America. On the same day, the Daily Telegraph put it more offensively that Lawrence wrote, "With one hand always in the slime." In peacetime England, during the early 20th century, there was no official who was authorised to perform the function of censor in respect of literature, so that censorship took place in varying ways. Legal control, self-censorship by the author, by agents, publishers, booksellers, or libraries, all based upon their understanding of what was permissible to avoid prosecution. During Lawrence's life, the courts played a decisive role in legal censorship, determining what could or could not be published. Judges and magistrates, although ostensibly bound by precedent and statute law, were influenced by their own prejudices, which in turn were affected by their moral, social, and political values. Working class people couldn't aspire to the judiciary or even to the magistracy. So generally, judges and magistrates' views were paternalistically conservative and upper middle class. Lawrence's first experiences of censorship came in 1910, when he was asked by Heinemann, his then publishers, to revise his first novel. And then just before publication of what was now The White Peacock, to change what might be considered objectionable. In July 1912, Heinemann declined Paul Morel, as its want of reticence makes it unfit for publication in England. The tyrannies of the libraries is such that a book far less outspoken would certainly be damned. For Duckworth, however, Edward Garnett's professional editing, toning down, and deletion of sexual content made it acceptable to circulating libraries, thereby avoiding prosecution, and it was published under the title of Sons and Lovers. Prosecutions could be instigated by a common informer and destruction ordered by a single magistrate, so the majority of books could be suppressed with little publicity. It was only when an important book came before a court that it obtained publicity. This happened in the autumn of 1915 with publication of The Rainbow. In the spring of 1915, Lawrence had written, "I have finished my rainbow, now off and away to find the pots of gold at its feet." He had rewritten the book several times and sent it to Methuen for publication, who had no Edward Garnett working for them. It was published on the 30th of September 1915 and reviewed on the 5th of October in the Daily News by Robert Lind, who described it as a monotonous wilderness of phallicism. Apart from the book's erotic content, James Douglas's review in the London Star criticised the novel on moral and patriotic grounds. He wrote, "A thing like the rainbow has no right to exist in the wind of war. The young men who are dying for liberty are moral beings." In The Rainbow, Ursula criticises Skrebensky for his role in the Boer War. She taunts him, asking if he likes being a soldier and if he wants to go to war. Skrebensky replies that he thinks it would be exciting. Ursula expresses the brutal reality of war. "But when you're dead, you don't matter anymore." Skrebensky proclaims he must do his duty by the nation. Ursula questions the identity of the nation and therefore Skrebensky's duty to defend England and the Empire. Content of this type was inflammatory in 1915. The police attended Methuen's office on the 3rd and 5th of November to seize all copies of the book, and a case was brought to court on the 13th of November under the Obscene Publications Act 1857. Herbert Musket, prosecuting, quoted the reviews of Lind and Douglas and pointed to the criticism of the Boer War in the book, which he maintained hindered recruitment. The magistrate, Sir John Dickinson, whose only son had recently been killed in the war, said he had never read anything more disgusting than this book, and drew attention to the chapter entitled Shame. He regretted that Methuen had been soiled by the publication of this work. The reviews obviously had an effect, though Richard Aldington has suggested that the prosecution was instigated by the London Public Morality Council, a body of puritanical fanatics who are making themselves patriotically useful by trying to suppress anything they didn't approve. Lawrence only heard of the raid on Methuen after it had taken place. He was not given the opportunity to be heard in court. Methuen did not defend the case, but apologised for the author's work and agreed to destroy all copies of the Rainbow in their possession, without reference to him. If Lawrence had had the funds or sufficient backing, he might have been able to apply to interplead in the case, but there was no attempt to appeal to a higher court and no further action was taken. On the 1st of December 1915 in Parliament, Philip Morell questioned whether the proceedings were the result of the 1914 Defence of the Realm Act. This act enabled the British government to exert coercive powers on anyone deemed to be an enemy alien. It was likely that Lawrence had been targeted. The war was in its early stages, and Lawrence was married to a German. He was not a pacifist, but was outspoken in his revulsion towards war. The result of the prosecution was that Lawrence owed Methuen his advance. His work was stigmatised as being obscene, so that publishers were unwilling to accept his work. He was therefore unable to earn for a considerable time. At the beginning of 1920, The Rainbow was still out of print in England, and Women in Love unpublished. Lawrence needed to make money and saw commercial potential in The Lost Girl. Although Martin Secker was eager to publish this novel, he told Lawrence in October 1920 that 3 libraries had declined it and asked him to remove the passages they objected to. Secker was even more cautious about Women in Love, and Lawrence was again asked to make changes. It was published in June 21, and although Lawrence feared problems, there was no police action against it. He was also asked to modify Aaron's Rod. Otherwise, those who maintain that his readers buy his book not for art, but for pornography, are going to get the upper hand. Lawrence returned the manuscript to the publishers, who amended it, and the novel was left alone by the police. Although in the early 20s, Lawrence's works avoided police suppression, numerous Home Office files indicate concern with indecent publications. When Sir William Joynson Hicks became Home Secretary in 1924, the problem became more prominent. He was a leading evangelical and president of the National Church League, and was assisted in his role by the London Public Morality Council. He is regarded as being responsible for the rigid application of the law with regard to obscene publications. Towards the end of the decade, Lawrence's literary work again became the subject of legal censorship, but this time the object was distribution rather than publication, as contraventions of the Post Office Act 1908 and the Customs Act 1867. Lady Chatterley's Lover was a calculated challenge to convention. Lawrence decided to publish privately in Florence with the help of his bookseller friend Giuseppe Orioli. The final version was completed on the 8th of January 1928 and was the most improper novel in the world. Prior to publication, Lawrence and Orioli had been writing to prospective purchasers in Britain and America, and had received considerable orders and payment. As copies became ready, about 20 a day, Orioli sent them out by registered book post. Some booksellers, on examining the contents, refused to accept the copies they'd ordered. Fearing prosecution, under the Obscene Publications Act. However, in England, Lawrence's friends collected them and, together with receiving consignments themselves, distributed them discreetly. Since the book had not been printed and published in England, and the author was domiciled abroad, the procedure for censoring was different from the Rainbow. The attack was against the book as it entered the country. British customs authorities began confiscating copies, and because Lawrence couldn't enforce copyright in the work, he suffered from the rivalry of pirated editions. By December 1928, he was at his wit's end trying to get out a Paris edition. In March 1929, he located a bookseller named Edward Titus, who printed 3,000 copies. This edition included an introduction entitled My Skirmish with Jolly Roger, in which Lawrence defended his book and scorned the pirates. Lawrence had been aware of the possibility of post office intervention and initially thought his post was getting through normally. However, on the 21st of January 1929, he received news from his agent's representative, Lawrence Collinger, that the police had seized 6 copies of Lady Chatterley's letter addressed to him. The same month, Bridget Patmore had had her 6 copies of Lady Chatterley seized in the post and been visited by the police. Lawrence wrote to Earl and Axa Brewster, "In our world, there's no news, except that the police have started seizing any copies of Lady C that go into England and seem to threaten a little campaign against me." Lawrence saw the personal dangers of returning to England. He wrote to Lady Ottoline Morel, "I can even be arrested if I come to England. Under the post office laws, oh la la." An expurgated version was published in England in 1932, but it was not until August 1960 that an unexpurgated version was published here, deliberately as a test, and there followed the well-publicised Penguin trial in November 1960, when the jury accepted the book had artistic merit and therefore rejected the allegation that it was obscene. In January 1929, Lawrence soon found it wasn't only Lady Chatterley which was threatened. The Postmaster General, under the Post Office Act, intercepted in the mail 2 sealed and registered packets sent from Bandol. One contained Lawrence's introduction to a volume of reproductions of his paintings, the other a manuscript of poems under the name of Pansies, on their way to his agent, Curtis Brown. Joyce and Hicks told the House of Commons in answer to a member's question that they had been mailed as open book post, which was sometimes investigated as post office routine. The post office had been disturbed by them and sent them to the Home Office, which sent them to the Director of Public Prosecutions, who suggested to the publisher, Secker, that 14 of the poems should be removed, and they were. The complete collection was published privately in London in 1929. It was obvious from Lawrence's letters that when he sent the manuscripts through, he didn't know whether the publishers would agree to publish them, but it was the mere sending through post of any indecent or obscene matter which created the offence. Since his Pansies and his essay on the paintings were sent respectively on the 7th and 14th January and seized soon afterwards, and Pollinger's copies of Lady Chatterley were seized on the 18th of January, these events are unlikely to have been coincidental. After the Home Office warrant had been issued against Lady Chatterley, it was obvious that Lawrence was at this stage a marked man, and the authorities had instructions to intercept post from him. When Lawrence wrote from abroad, he was in the habit of putting his name and address on the outside of the package, so his mail could easily be traced. It may have been that the post office was simply looking for copies of Lady Chatterley. The matter came before the House of Commons on the 14th of February 29, when the Home Secretary was asked whether he gave instructions for a manuscript of poems sent by D.H. Lawrence to his literary agent to be seized before any question of publication arose. Joynson Hicks ingenuously replied that typescripts were sent through open book post and opened as routine, and that he gave no such instructions. He then asserted there is nothing which can properly be described as a literary censorship in this country, and that nobody, no official of state, can open a sealed packet without the direct warrant of the Secretary of State. However, Lawrence's packages had been mailed by sealed and registered letterpost. From this, it can be seen that collaboration, or rather collusion, between Home Office, Post Office and Customs continued after the First World War. Lawrence was relieved that after the general election in May 1929, Joynson Hicks was no longer Home Secretary. However, only a few weeks later, his works were again to become the subject of censorship, but this time it was his paintings rather than his literature. Dorothy Warren and Philip Trotter were the owners of the Warren Gallery in London, and in November 1928, Lawrence had written to Dorothy Brett, "Dorothy Warren keeps my pictures hanging in her gallery and shows them to God knows who, but doesn't open her exhibition. I suppose she's nervous because John Ball and the Sunday Chronicle came out with blasts against Lady C." The exhibition did open with a private view on the 14th of June 1929. After the opening, the Observer commented, "This author-artist, weary perhaps of being subtly misbehaved in print, has elected to come straight to the point and is frankly disgusting in paint." The Daily Express stated, "The ugly composition, colouring and drawing of these works makes them repellent enough, but the subjects of some of them will compel most spectators to recoil with horror." On the 5th of July 1929, the police raided the gallery and seized 13 of Lawrence's 25 pictures. Using their discretion, they had decided that any picture showing pubic hair was automatically prescribed. They also took 4 copies of the Book of Reproductions. For a time, they impounded a book of Blake's pencil drawings. It was only when they were told the significance of Blake's work that they didn't take it. They were inclined to take a French translation of The Hunting of the Snark until Dorothy Warren explained it was written for children by an English clergyman. At a subsequent hearing at Great Marlborough Street Magistrates Court on the 8th of August, Warren and Trotter were summoned to show cause why the paintings should not be destroyed. The defence advocate argued that they were works of art. He could have taken the case to the High Court, but Lawrence was anxious that the paintings should not be destroyed. And it was agreed that the case was adjourned generally, the 13 pictures released and restored to their owners, and the 4 books of reproductions destroyed. The exhibition wasn't closed, and apparently this was the first case under the 1857 Act against an art gallery. In conclusion, had the Home Secretaries of the period been less zealous, fewer books would have been referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions, and so there would have been fewer prosecutions and less publicity given to obscenity and censorship. Had Douglas and the popular press been less inclement in their reviews, attention would not have been drawn to the books they were reviewing. One might hope that Douglas honestly believed it was his duty to protect his readers, but more likely he realised that exclamatory comment would make good copy. Although the Director of Public Prosecutions was responsible for instigating proceedings, It was the Home Secretary, Sir William Joynson Hicks, who believed that even though there was no official censor for books, the government had responsibility for the moral welfare of the people, and it had to protect the country from writers like Lawrence. With the law as it was, the suppression of the rainbow is not surprising. Interestingly, when the Obscene Publications Act was passed in 1857, the Chief Justice had assured Parliament that it was intended to apply exclusively to works written for the single purpose of corrupting the morals of youth and of a nature calculated to shock the common feelings of decency in any well-regulated mind. Ultimately, the Chief Justice's assurances to Parliament were abused by those purporting to enforce it. After the First World War, the government seemed unwilling to give up the extra powers of censorship it had gained. Although it would never admit to there being any official censor, it operated a very thorough check on letters and packets in the post, which is how the packet containing Lawrence's pansies and essay on the paintings came to be opened. After the publication of Lady Chatterley's Lover, Lawrence's post was under scrutiny. The Warren Gallery exhibition must have seemed like the final straw to the authorities. Would they never be able to repress this man? Since he lived abroad, there was no action that could be taken against him personally, although he was threatened with arrest if he returned to England. Although other writers experienced harsh treatment in the press and under the law, Lawrence probably suffered to a greater extent. His professional career in England was seriously damaged, and the strain hurt his health. Lawrence had remarked that the value of his writing would be recognised only after his death. It is, however, true that without the attendant publicity from censorship, he would not be as widely known as he is today. Thank you.
Am I heard now? Unmute.
Yeah, we can hear you fine, Alan.
You can hear me? Okay. Right, thank you. So now I'd like to introduce Richard. Richard Keeble is Professor of Journalism at the University of Lincoln and Honorary Professor at Liverpool Hope University. He's written and edited 43 books on a wide range of media-related topics. He was chair of the Orwell Society from 2013 to 20. He edited Orwell Today, 2012, and George Orwell Now, in 2015. In 2020, Routledge published his journalism Beyond Orwell and Abramus George Orwell, The Secret State and the Making of 1984. Abramus recently published his Orwell's Moustache. Richard is Emeritus Editor of Ethical Space, the International Journal of Communication Ethics, and Joint Editor of George Orwell's Studies. In 2011, he gained a National Teaching Fellowship, the highest award for teachers in higher education in the UK. And in 2014, he was given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Association for Journalism Education. Richard is a member of the Louth Male Voice Choir, the Louth Film Club, and the Nottinghamshire County Cricket Club. And I also learned the other day that Richard is a very competent pianist. He does a lot of accompanying and indeed has performed several solo recitals. So Richard, I look forward to doing a piano duet together, the two chairmen.
Wow. Yeah.
So anyway, over to Richard. The talk is Extraordinary Power of Imagination, Orwell's Passion for Lawrence. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you. Right, can you see that?
Yeah.
Can you see that, Neil?
That's fine.
You can see my slides.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, Alan, thanks for that very generous introduction. I look forward to that piano duet. Yeah, very much. Right. I'm going to break my talk into 5 sections. I'm going to begin on a personal note. I'm going to look at how Orwell and Lawrence can be seen to have lived strikingly parallel lives and how aspects of their lives overlapped. I'll examine the extraordinary extent to which Orwell responded to Lawrence's writings throughout his career. I'll highlight the way Lawrence's writings impacted on Orwell's style, and I'll finish with a conclusion. So my personal note to begin with, I've long been interested in both George Orwell and D.H. Lawrence. Orwell, the radical, so often witty journalist, has been an inspiration for me, both as the editor of a trade union newspaper in the early 1980s, and as a journalism academic since 1984 at City University, London, and Lincoln University. From 2013 to 2020, I was chair of the Orwell Society, and over that time immersed myself deeply in his writings and life story. On Lawrence, I feel I almost grew up in Nottingham with him. My mother, Molly Burroughs, was the cousin of Louis Burroughs, to whom Lawrence was engaged for a short while. Mother rarely spoke of Louis, but I do remember members of the family describing Lawrence very dismissively as that pornographer. My sister Margaret, who sadly died a few years ago, studied English literature at Leeds University and taught Lawrence inspirationally to her students in Oakville, Toronto, for many years. As chair of the Orwell Society, I helped organize a joint meeting with the H.G. Wells Society. A joint meeting with the D.H. Lawrence Society seemed a logical follow-up. So, to move on to parallel lives. On the surface, George Orwell, born Eric Blair, and D.H. Lawrence appear very different kinds of writers. Orwell, the old Etonian imperial policeman, Republican militiaman in the Spanish Civil War, BBC broadcaster, activist journalist, relatively unknown novelist until the global success of Animal Farm in 1984 at the end of his life. Lawrence, the son of a miner, ever-wandering author of a series of psychologically profound, radically structured novels, exploring the complexities of human relationships, spirituality, and sexuality. Yet many aspects of their lives ran intriguingly in parallel. Both men suffered from ill health throughout their lives, though did not take sufficient care of themselves. Both started careers in teaching, but had to quit due to ill health. Both are to die tragically young of tuberculosis, Lawrence at 44, Orwell at 46. Quite coincidentally, Dr. Andrew Morland is to treat both men for tuberculosis in their final days. Both benefited in their teens from relationships with a number of young women based on a shared love of reading, intellectual pursuits, and nature. For Lawrence, it's in particular Jessie Chambers standing there behind her father at Hang's Farm. For Eric Blair, it was Jacintha Buddicombe. Both Lawrence and Blair are in Paris in 1929. Lawrence organising, as we've heard, the publication of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Orwell beginning his stay in the French capital, living down and out and embarking on his career as a writer. Maybe they even crossed each other unawares on opposite sides of the road one day. Who knows? Both writers face censorship. Brenda has covered this aspect of Lawrence's life so expertly. Certainly concerns over censorship, self-censorship, freedom of expression, and press and broadcasting freedom were constant throughout Orwell's life. One of his first articles was about censorship in England, which he wrote while in Paris for the journal Monde, edited by the communist Henri Barbusse. His first novels were subject to rigorous editing cuts due to fears over libel, blasphemy, and their overtly sexual content. Just before the outbreak of war, in August 1939, Orwell's home in Wallington is raided by the police, who take away novels by Henry Miller and Lady Chatterley's Lover. Later, the police return Lady Chatterley's Lover. As Orwell writes to his publisher, Victor Gollancz, it appears Miller's books have not been in print long enough to have become respectable. Orwell's essay, Benefit of Clergy, commenting on Salvador Dali's scurrilous memoir, is initially banned by the publishers Hutchinson on the grounds of obscenity in 1944, though it is later published in his critical essays. An Animal Farm, his damning critique of the Soviet Union, appearing in the following year, is initially rejected by a number of publishers afraid to promote a text placing the wartime ally in such a bad light. Now for the overlaps. Intriguingly, a number of men played significant roles in both Lawrence's and Orwell's lives. Aldous Huxley was Orwell's teacher at Eton and one of Lawrence's closest friends in his later life. John Middleton Murray launched the Adelphi magazine in large part to promote the writings of Lawrence. Some of Orwell's first writings in the early 1930s were published in the New Adelphi, as it was renamed under the editorship of Sir Richard Rees. While on Capri in 1919, the writer Compton Mackenzie finds a flat for Lawrence and his wife Frida, whom he's known since meeting them in Buckinghamshire in 1914. Lawrence even composes a short story, The Man Who Loved Islands, loosely based on Mackenzie. On 25 May 1940, Orwell addresses the 34th annual conference of the Dickens Fellowship at the Comedy Restaurant in London and meets for the first time Mackenzie, who proposes the toast to the immortal memory of Dickens. It is to prove a fateful meeting, for in their chat a seed is planted that is to flower in Orwell's decision a few years later to withdraw to the remote Scottish island of Jura. Now, my third section, I'll consider Orwell's enduring love of Lawrence. Thanks to the editing of Orwell's complete works by Peter Davison, published in 20 volumes in 1998, we can see clearly the extent to which Orwell, the letter writer, engaged with Lawrence, and throughout his career as an essayist, reporter, book reviewer, cultural observer, and campaigner against censorship. It will be impossible to cover all the 71 references today, so I'll focus briefly on just two. In a remarkable essay in the weekly journal Tribune of November 1945, Orwell reviews Lawrence as the Prussian officer and other stories being reprinted as a penguin. He tells how he goes into his schoolmaster's study at Eton and, finding him absent, picks up a magazine and is immediately struck by a poem. Unknown to him at the time, it's Lawrence's Cruelty and Love. 4 or 5 years later, still not having heard of Lawrence, Orwell picks up a copy of The Prussian Officer while he's serving as an imperial policeman in Burma, and is again impressed by Lawrence's writing, his hatred of military discipline and understanding of its nature, particularly in the short story The Thorn in the Flesh. He goes on to comment on Lawrence. He was, in essence, a lyric poet and an undisciplined enthusiast for nature. The surface of the earth was one of his principal qualities, though it has been much less noticed than his preoccupation with sex. Next, he praises Lawrence's account of the death scene in his short story, England, My England. Orwell clearly titles his patriotic essay, England, Your England, composed in 1941 at a critical moment in the Second World War, when invasion by the Nazis appeared a distinct possibility, as a way of acknowledging Lawrence's legacy, though he deliberately changes Lawrence's anti-war stance to a stirring pro-war one. As John Warden points out, Lawrence expresses his fundamental opposition to the war and to the spirit of war in the short story. But he is never a pacifist. In 1916, for instance, he condemns some pacifist pamphlets for being, quotes, too squashy altogether. Orwell next singles out for praise the short story, Daughters of the Vicar. In Orwell's description of Mary here as, quotes, the underfed, downtrodden, organ-playing daughter of a clergyman wearing out her youth, does she not resemble in some way Dorothy Hare, the central character of his novel A Clergyman's Daughter of 1935? And while the plots of the two novels are certainly different, in the choice of title, is Orwell not acknowledging once again his literary debt to Lawrence? Lawrence also appears a number of times in The Road to Wigan Pier. I can mention only one. Orwell's first account of travelling in the north of England, investigating the plight of the poor and miners' lives. Towards the end of the first chapter, he leaves Wigan by train. As he sees the hills of the industrial landscape covered with snow, he remembers, of all people, Lawrence. Quotes, out here the snow was untrodden and lay so deep that only the tops of the stone boundary walls were showing, winding over the hills like black paths. I remember Lawrence writing of this same landscape or another nearby, said the snow-covered hills rippled away into the distance like muscle. It was not a simile that would have occurred to me. To my eye, the snow and the black walls were more like a white dress with black piping running across it. Now I'll talk about Lawrence's influence on Orwell's writing style. Lawrence's impact on subsequent writers is generally seen as being vast. Orwell is hardly ever mentioned in this context by Lawrence scholars, occasionally en passant by commentators on Orwell. The influence is most evident in Orwell's first novel, Burmese Days, of 1934. According to Peter Stansky and Wilbur Abrahams, the influences of Lawrence and Somerset Maugham are striking. Lawrence's way led to the deeply felt descriptions of landscape. Maugham's way to the sardonic observation of the club in action. Orwell's way to the anti-imperialism, which is the dominant theme of the novel. Biographer Geoffrey Myers highlights in Orwell's novel, A Clergyman's Daughter, the Laurentian descriptions of Dorothy communing with nature, or fending off the attentions of an older admirer, Mr. Warburton. While a distinctive Laurentian influence appears in Orwell's novel of 1936, Keep the Aspidistra Flying. According to biographer John Worthen, almost all of Lawrence's writing, particularly after he meets Frida Weekly in 1912, aims to create a language of our experience of the body and its desires. Sexuality, similarly, also features significantly throughout Orwell's writings. For instance, Orwell's partly fictionalized memoir of his time at St. Cyprian's Prep School near Eastbourne between 1911 and 1917, Such Were the Joys, is remarkable for its sexual explicitness. Carefully, he teases out the chronology of his sexual awakening. At 5 or 6, quotes, like many children, so aiming to generalize from the personal, he moves from a period of sexuality. I quote, "My friends were the plumber's children up the road, and we used sometimes to play games of a vaguely erotic kind. One was called playing at doctors, and I remember getting a faint but definitely pleasant thrill from holding a toy trumpet, which was supposed to be a stethoscope, against a little girl's belly. Next, he falls deeply in with a girl named Elsie, and he goes on to dwell on his boyhood's sexual confusions with what appears compelling honesty, though it may well be all fiction. Most of the facts of life, capital F, capital L, those capital letters indicating their importance and severity, are learned through watching animals. Moreover, passionate sexuality lies at the heart of both the themes and narrative of 1984, with the secret love affair between Winston Smith and Julia, the girl from the fiction department. Sexuality is represented as a pure life force that could one day destroy the party. On a critical note, Orwell's stress on the utterly unresisting Julia reflects Orwell's obsession throughout his novels with sexual performance as possession and the affirmation of manhood. Feminist critics such as Kate Millett also argue that Lawrence's representation of sexuality is similarly informed by patriarchy. So, my conclusion. As I've highlighted in my talk, the extraordinary impact Orwell's first readings of Lawrence is to last throughout his life. Lawrence crops up regularly in his writings and broadcasts, often in surprising context. So it is intriguing to ponder why Lawrence scholars, Orwell's scholars much less so, to date have largely failed to acknowledge this. Andrew Harrison has kindly alerted me to Michael Ross's excellent essay in the D.H. Lawrence Review of 1984 on Lawrence and Lady Chatterley's lover, but maybe that's an exception. In conclusion, it's worth quoting Geoffrey Mayers, who significantly has written biographies of both writers and who does acknowledge the links between them. Orwell, he says, was influenced by Wells, admired Joyce, was taught by Huxley, befriended Eliot and Wall, and satirized W.H. Auden. And I quote, "But the writer he most resembled was D.H. Lawrence, who died in 1930, just as Blair was beginning his literary career. They hated the class system, attacked bourgeois values, their defiant books suppressed. In private life, they had a puritanical streak, refused to use contraceptives, and feared or believed they were sterile. They were given to ferocious exaggerations, violent fantasies, outbursts of rage, and prophetic doom. They suffered poor health all their lives, were treated by the same doctor, and died of tuberculosis in their mid-40s. Above all, they were courageous writers faced with formidable adversaries who spoke the truth." Thank you.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much to Neil for doing all the practical stuff that's enabled this to happen. And thank you both very much for your talks tonight. Good night.
Pleasure.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Brenda and Richard.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Should have clapped, don't you?